Hi, Misha here, and I wanted to start off by saying sorry I haven't done many videos recently. I ended up catching a bit of a bug that kind of hung around for 5-6 days and wouldn't go anywhere. It was really annoying. Especially because I have quite a few new models to talk about. And some will be ship models, something I haven't done in quite a while. Under the brand name Motor City Classic Legendary Battleships, there have been 5 new models in one 1,250 scale diecast. And I've actually seen this brand before, or at least this tooling, out of China/Japan a couple of years ago under the KB brand. And they seem to be tangentially related to the Eagle Moss brand as well. And I have 4 out of the 5 launch ships in this new American series. I picked up the USS Arizona, why not? The USS Lexington, because I'm a sucker for any carrier. And the USS, which one was this one? Massachusetts, which is a South Dakota-class battleship, something we don't see much over here, except Americum did a 1/1000 scale model, but it's, And I like that these do come in large cases, just plastic, but it's good for protection. But I thought we would start off talking about this one here. Again, I'm a sucker for carriers. The USS Hornet of the Yorktown-class. And to help me talk about it, I brought out my USS Enterprise. Same Yorktown-class, although this model is from the Eagle Moss collection, so it's actually 1/1100 scale, so slightly larger scale, but needs must, and they're close enough that I don't think it invalidates. Ironically, this one's about as heavy. Yeah, but these have an all-metal hull with plastic detailing for the deck and what have you. So, yeah, we'll talk about the history of the Yorktown class a bit, specifically the USS Hornet. The Yorktown class itself started off in the late 1920s. Now, the Washington Naval Treaty kind of informs all of post-World War I shipbuilding. And the U.S. was limited to 135,000 tons for carriers. Its first carrier was a conversion, the USS Langley CV-1. But it wasn't counted because it was an experimental craft. The first true carriers were the USS Lexington over here that we'll get to in the next video, and her sister USS Saratoga. Now those started off as battle cruisers, but were converted before they were even a quarter complete into purpose-built carriers, and actually would remain the largest carriers America had for a long time. They were CV-2 and CV-3. Next was the small carrier USS Ranger, and that would be CV-4. And this gets us to CV-5 and CV-6, USS Yorktown and USS Enterprise, because Hornet was not originally envisioned. They had about 54,400 tons left over they could play with. And after working with Lexington and Saratoga, and later Ranger, they kind of knew what they wanted. They wanted a large air group. Ranger showed them pretty clearly that small air groups, just 3-4 dozen planes, not enough. So, 80 planes plus. They also realized that speed was important. The carrier needed to keep up with modern battleships, battle cruisers, that were over 30 knots. Also, torpedoes. The Japanese were working a lot with torpedoes like the Long Lance, And yeah, that was just something that they were mindful for. So torpedo protection, especially armor in general, a large flight group, and good speed. How to do this? Well, the first proposal was for a 17,000-ton class ship. And given the weight they had to work with, they could build 3 of these. But it didn't work out. They realized that they couldn't have everything they wanted in such a light ship. And things got worse in 1930 when the USS Langley was reclassed by the London Treaty to become part of the overall tonnage. So, yeah, they even had fewer. That's where this came in, the design here. This was a 19,000, nominally 20,000 ton vessel that gave the speed, the protection, and the flight group they wanted. Now, they could only build 2 of these, but they found a way to work with Langley. They reworked her as an airplane, a sea tender, freeing up the full 54,000 ton limit. And this is actually where CV-7 comes from, USS Wasp. Wasp was actually a scaled down 14,000 ton version of the Yorktown-class. So pretty skimpy, but yeah. So the idea, 2 full carriers, nominally 20,000 tons, up to 25,000 fully loaded, and then a smaller one. These vessels are about 770 feet at the water line, about 810 feet at the top of the hull, and the flight deck extends out to just shy of 825 feet. So not small at all. And they were built to have a flight group of 78, but due to new practices in the 30s and 40s, they ended up carrying over 90 aircraft at some point. They would have 5-inch guns for surface defense, and their anti-aircraft armament would change multiple times. And they were quite quick, depending on the ship and the day, anywhere from 32 knots to just shy of 34 knots. And they had a very good range, at least compared to a lot of their contemporaries, of about 12,500 miles. That was another thing that was very important. They had a total of 3 elevators. They would have a few different catapults over time. They would kind of be changed out. You know, ships get rebuilt. And the first 2 were ordered in 1935 and would, progress throughout the 30s, coming into service later in the decade. And then, of course, like I said, Wasp. Hornet here. Well, in 1937, due to activities from Italy, Japan, and Germany, all the treaty systems fell apart and were abrogated, and so the whole tonnage limit went out the window. For the long term, America decided to create a whole new class of carrier, which would become the Essex class. But it would take some time to get these going. In the interim, they decided to order a 3rd Yorktown-class to a slightly modified, improved, modernized design. But because they needed it as quick as possible, what they could change was pretty limited. But still, another carrier was better than none. Even though it was meant to be an interim solution until the Essex class would come around, it was a damn good thing they had Hornet, because basically in 1942, these were the ships, the Yorktown classes, that would carry the load in the war in the Pacific until the Essex would come along. In fact, at various times, both Enterprise and Hornet here would be the only operational fleet carrier in the whole Pacific that the U.S. Navy had. So, yeah, important is not even saying enough. But today, let's talk about our featured ship, Hornet here, and we can always revisit the Big E in another video again if you want. On to the spinny thingy. The USS Hornet, CV-8. CV-8. Nicknames include the Happy Hornet or the Fighting Hornet, the Lucky Lady, or my personal favorite, the Horny Maru. Yeah. Interesting, although very brief, career for this ship. It was ordered, funded, what have you, in March of 1939. It was laid down at the end of September of that same year. It was launched about a week before Christmas in 1940. And it was officially commissioned on October 20, 1941. So prior to Pearl Harbor, although just barely. And originally, it was given to Captain Misha and assigned to the Atlantic Fleet. But it was not really active when Pearl Harbor happened. It was still very much on its shakedown cruise, working up, training its air group, what have you. Speaking of, originally she was built intending to carry 18 each fighters, dive/standard bomber, and torpedo bomber, as well as 37 scout aircraft and 6 kind of other utility purpose type aircraft. She wouldn't always have this same complement, but it gives you an idea of kind of where they were at. And like I said, this was built to a somewhat modified design. For example, it had updated, newer, better fire control systems for its guns. It had better sensors, better radar, and the radar would continue to improve. The propulsion system was improved for both efficiency and just longevity. And probably the most noticeable difference externally, the superstructure was changed up a little bit, altered, kind of minimized slightly, just to make it a little less vulnerable and kind of work on things that they noticed weren't perfect with Yorktown and Enterprise. Again, they really didn't have time to make more changes if they wanted to get it launched, and it's a very good thing they did, because it would take until early spring of 1942 before the shakedown cruise was over and this could join the fight. And keep in mind, this was when America needed every ship it could, but you know, you can't rush some things. Now this model, and the reason I really wanted it, is kind of made to represent the Hornet on her most famous mission and her kind of introduction to the Japanese to say hello, the Doolittle raid. And I say that because on its deck here, you see a couple of tiny B-25 Mitchells. Now, I've talked about this raid extensively when I talked about the B-25 itself. It's actually one of my favorite World War II bombers. And you might wonder, it's a U.S. Army Air Corps, later Army Air Forces aircraft. What the hell is it doing on the deck of a Navy ship? Frankly, the sailors wondered the same thing themselves. While still in the Atlantic, a couple of these were tested out, but it was very, very hush-hush. And then she would cross oceans, going through the Panama Canal, and once they get in the Pacific, they get more of these stuck on her, along with orders that are sealed up. So they ended up getting 16 of these Army bombers. And the bombers themselves had to be specially lightened and modified because in no way, shape, or form were they designed to take off from a carrier. Remember, like I said, this thing has a flight deck of 825 feet. The width, depending on exactly where you're at, is only about 109 feet. That's maximum for the flight deck. Moving down, it gets to 80 some odd feet at the hull. And this bomber is about 67 feet by 53 feet. So it's more than half as wide as the whole flight deck. And, you know, only about 13 times less than the whole ship. Yeah, and having 16 of them on board. So, yeah, the Doolittle raid, kind of America's introduction. It's a very important political event and really worth telling. And that was this ship's introduction to the whole Pacific Fleet because, again, it had been in the Atlantic. And so they got it over as much as they could. Worked up in March of 1942, and in April they set sail to launch the Doolittle raid with the 16 bombers to hit Tokyo and other targets. Now, since the Hornet could not launch her own aircraft with these bombers strapped to her deck, the Enterprise was assigned to escort and protect her. She would be very vulnerable until after the bombers launched. Her own airplanes were on board, but they were below decks in the hangars, some of them disassembled. So, they launch them. They did have to launch early because the task force was spotted by a Japanese patrol boat. They were worried that if it gave away the positions and if the Japanese assaulted, keep in mind this is very much pre-Midway, so the Japanese have the upper hand in April, that they could ambush and the Hornet would be a sitting target. And they weren't, if they were able to sink both the Hornet and her sister ship Enterprise, that'd be it for the Americans. So even though they were a couple hundred miles before their planned launch, the captain ordered the bombers take off. It's better safe than sorry. And all 16 did. And they would all, complete their mission. Although, of course, they would have to bail out over disputed China instead of making it to friendly airfields further inland in China. Story for another day. Hornet herself, as soon as the bombers were gone, readied her fighters and turned around. As it turns out, the Japanese boat did spot them and did radio home. The only thing that really saved them, the message was unclear and garbled, and before it could get off a second follow-up message, it was sunk. So, yeah. So their caution was warranted. So, Hornet would head back to Pearl Harbor and get ready for its new assignment to the Pacific Fleet. But again, the Doolittle raid, very impressive piece of, flying, naval engineering, bombing, piloting, everything. A very neat part of history. And I just really thought having this model with the little tiny bombers on the deck was just too cool not to do. Little split tail here. They were so jam-packed on the deck that the last few actually were hanging out over the edge. Their tails are hanging out. And the ones at the front, including Doolittle himself, his plane had very little space to take off in. It was a spine-chilling takeoff, I have no doubt. So, full props to them. And then Hornet herself would start her daily life of, warfare in the Pacific. At the end of April, Hornet was sent out to reinforce and help Yorktown and Lexington. It will become the Battle of the Coral Sea. But Hornet did not make it there before the battle was over. And the battle did not go well for the Americans. It was a draw, I guess you would say. Yorktown was pretty heavily damaged, although recoverable. And Lexington was lost. So she'd have a few little things here and there in May, but mostly returned back to Pearl Harbor. Would stay in port for a couple of days, refueling, getting ready, and then at the end of May was sent out to take part in what would become the Battle of Midway. And that's a whole thing, you know about it, I'm sure. But on June 4, Hornet did not show so well. Her air group in particular, it was a whole new ship. Everyone on board, over 2,200 people, were pretty new to this. But her air group, and especially, just hadn't had much practice at all. And it showed. Her Dauntlesses were lost to every single one of them during raids. and that's because a lot of her fighters got lost during the famous flight to nowhere. The only aircraft she really had left were those fighters kept back for CAP, combat air patrol, and just defense. Some spares that they put together from parts below, a handful of bombers, and some other planes that they took on board from other carriers because at Midway, Yorktown, already damaged, would actually be lost. So she would take on some of the planes from her sister ship. She would send out another major offense, or at least probing operation. This time again, she did not have any success against the enemy, but at least with the second one, she didn't really lose any planes. It wasn't a catastrophe. So, yeah. At the end of the battle, as the Japanese fleet was retreating, the American fleet would harass them and harry them, and planes from Hornet did help sink a heavy cruiser and damage another cruiser and damage or destroy a couple of destroyers. So at least they finally kind of got their due at the end of the battle. But although Midway was very much a success for the Americans, it came at a cost, as war always does. Afterwards, Hornet would go back to Pearl Harbor to repair minor damage and give some improvements. Again, very young ship, still kind of working out the kinks. They wanted to install an updated, better radar set. They wanted to improve her air defense, so they pulled off some older guns, put on some newers. And the captain was promoted to admiral and a new captain assigned, things like that. And they would kind of keep her back in July near Pearl Harbor. Even as the battle for Guadalcanal started to rage on, it was kind of a reserve force. They weren't sure what was going to go on. They didn't want to do all their eggs in the same basket. But eventually she would be sent out in August and help defend the area around Guadalcanal and the Battle of the Solomons. And quite sadly, from September 15 through October 24, this is when she would be the only operational fleet carrier America had. Enterprise and Saratoga had been damaged and had to go back for major repairs. Like I said, Yorktown was lost, Lexington was lost, Wasp was lost. So even though the war is starting to turn in favor of the Americans and the Japanese lost their fleet carriers too, she really had to hold the line. Yes, Enterprise would come back, but for 6 weeks, it was the Happy Maru, the Horny Maru. Can't mix up my metaphors. The Happy Hornet, the Horny Maru here, that they really had to do it. And of course, her pilots and crew would gain much needed experience during this period and starting to really earn a name for themselves. After all, between the Doolittle raid, the Battle of Midway, and now operations around Guadalcanal, the Solomon Islands, all this kind of at all the fun vacation spots in the Pacific. But unfortunately, her career, which had been very active, would come to an end just over a year from where it started. So, on October 24, the USS Enterprise, somewhat hastily patched up, was put back into service. Wouldn't be too much longer, and the USS Saratoga, who had been hit by a torpedo that September, would go back into service. And the major campaign, kind of still part of the overall Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands campaign, the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, would take place on October 26th. And it started off quite decent for Hornet here. Her planes did damage to multiple Japanese ships, including one of the few remaining carriers the Japanese had, Shokoku, and would help sink some other stuff. But unfortunately, Hornet kind of bore the brunt. It started off kind of bad. a flight of D-3A Val dive bombers spotted her. Even though her new air defense did quite well, 3 of them got bomb hits on her. They weren't fatal, though. And then one of the planes being damaged from her flak would land with force, land aggressively, and it hit her. It wasn't exactly what I'd call a kamikaze, because it wasn't that kind of deliberate, but the plane was already damaged, it was already going down, so in there. Plus, it received some other minor damage here and there from near misses and splinters and typical naval warfare. Not a big deal, really. Yeah. Another flight of D-3As would come in too. One of these would again kind of aggressively land on her. That didn't help. And they were kind of, yeah. But there was also a flight of B-5N Contos or Kates. These were torpedo bombers. Rather outdated design, but, And 2 of these were able to get torpedo hits on Hornet. And this was a problem, because the electrical system was majorly damaged and the engines were knocked out, so she was dead in the water. In fact, that's what allowed the second D-3A to end up smashing into her, because she was literally a sitting duck. Luckily, she was a sitting duck with friends, because cruisers and destroyers nearby would come alongside, help take some of the crew off, and send repair teams over. And they were actually doing a good job. They were about to get the electrical system patched up and about to get the engines online. There were no major hull breaches that couldn't be combated. So it looked like they were going to pull it out. And this is not anything new for American warships. These were designed with torpedo protection. American ships were, at least in terms of making them go down, pretty damn tough. So they almost had it, except another flight of B-5Ns would find the stricken Hornet, and of the 9, 8 would be shot down before they could do anything. Unfortunately, that 9th plane was able to deliver its single torpedo, and it was the coup de grace. It was just that bit that put it over the edge. So, the order was given to abandon ship, with the captain being the last one off Hornet. Oddly enough, though, once they decided to try to scuttle her, American ships couldn't do it. They hit her, or at least tried to, with several torpedoes. But here's the thing, and I've talked about it in previous videos and can again. In 1942, American torpedoes kind of sucked. So even though they hit her several times, a lot of the torpedoes failed to detonate. So the attempt to scuttle by the Americans, it didn't work. The Japanese would come along on October 27 and show them how it was done. Their long lance torpedo was actually devastatingly effective, and it would take 4 of these, and then Hornet would go to the bottom. Luckily, keeping in mind that over 2,000 souls were originally on board, she only took about 140 people with her. Not a bad ratio. I mean, I'm sure, no death is good, but 5% of your crew, with the majority making it off, including a lot of your planes even making it off, it wasn't the kind of devastating loss like the Japanese had suffered at Midway. But America did lose a valuable fleet carrier. It would be stricken from the Naval Registry in January of 1943. But Hornet wouldn't stay down for long. Not at all. From the boat's inception, it was an interim solution, a stopgap measure, something that America could get in the Pacific as quick as possible. Even though it only served essentially from April to October of 1942, it was enough. Again, it was the only carrier we had for 6 months in September and October, and was only one of a couple of carriers operational at various times in the summer. It bought time. It let Enterprise and Saratoga get repaired, and it filled in the gap when we lost Lexington and Yorktown. It mattered a lot. And it was there for a couple of very iconic missions. So it was more than worthwhile, I have to say. And it bought that time for the Essex to come online. The USS Essex CV-9, so the immediate carrier after this one, CV-8, was just about ready to go. And just to really thumb their noses at the Japanese, CV-10 was the USS Yorktown. See, there's another one, and it's a better Yorktown than the one that they sunk. CV-11 was nearing completion too. That would be the USS Intrepid. And CV-12 was more than halfway done, and it would be the USS Hornet. So again, the Japanese sink a carrier. We just rebuild it, make it bigger and better. I should point out that this trend would kind of continue, and this would be the last fleet carrier America would use, at least up until 2022, to enemy action. So that's a bit of a dubious place in history, but an honorable one nonetheless, because she went down fighting, and she went down in the service of her country. But yeah, this was the last major carrier we would ever lose in combat. Unfortunately, we also lost USS Enterprise, but not to combat. Despite its very good service history, it was scrapped. Yeah, it was tragedy. But that's a story for another day. But I think the history of the Hornet, really all of these, the Yorktown, the Enterprise, and the Hornet, are all interesting. Enterprise definitely has the most colorful history of this class, but, you know, Hornet's not far behind either. And I'm sure if I find a model of Yorktown, I'll probably buy her too, because there are small differences. Again, with the planes and the superstructures are being a little different. This isn't quite as nice of a model as the Eagle Moss here, but then again, these are inexpensive. They're about $25. So, yeah, and they are very much a metal hull. It's just the top is plastic. But there would be no really good way to do the top in metal and make it look good. So again, sorry guys that I haven't put out so many videos lately, but at least I'm trying to come back with something interesting. And next time we'll talk about some of these other recent imports from Motor City Classics Legendary. I believe it's battleships. It may be warships, but I think they call them battleships. And I once knew this as KB, which I imported from China, Japan, a couple of years ago. But let me know what you think. Anyone else have interest in World War II carriers? I hope so. So let me know. As always, if you could, please do like, share, subscribe, all that good fun stuff. This is Misha. Catch you very soon. Next time.